Deuteronomy. I don't know if you feel like we kind of rushed through chapters 1 through 3 or not, but it's an interesting study to me. I think it's challenging. And as we enter chapter 4, and I mentioned that, that Deuteronomy largely consists of sermons that Moses is giving to the children of Israel. The Israelites are on the precipice of entering the land, the promised land, and crossing the Jordan. And Moses is just about to die, and he's leaving them with these last sermons. And the first sermon really goes from chapter 1 through near the end of chapter 4, and then picks up in chapter 5, quite a long section where he covers all of the law. And so as we are in chapter 4 this morning, this really serves as a bridge, a transition from Moses. And remember last week we looked at, he rehearsed the history of Israel, and he said, remember what God has done. Remember, the choices that your fathers, your parents made. Remember the blessings God gave you and the punishments that he gave you. Remember. And he's looking back at that time, rehearsing the history of Israel from the deliverance from Egypt through to the precipice now of entering the land. And then the retelling of the commandments, the covenant agreement that God had made with Moses there on Mount Sinai. So this section really summarizes two simple mirror truths. And they are two mirror truths that are reiterated really through the chapter and really through the book. And they are that loyalty and obedience to God lead to blessing, inheritance, and life. And conversely, disloyalty and disobedience to God lead to curses, exile, and death. One thing we want to remember as we read through this chapter together is that while some of these people were indeed alive and born present at Horeb or Sinai, as we commonly call it today, they were children, and many of them were not even born yet. And so here Moses is speaking to this group of Israelites that were certainly not of decision-making, adult age, back when they were at Mount Sinai, when the commandments were first given. And so while the commandments and the law were indeed expounded to the people by Moses at Sinai, these people were either children or not born yet. And so it was necessary for Moses now to sort of start over, to reiterate, to make sure that this new generation was fully cognizant of that covenant that God had made with them. And why was this really necessary? Well, because their parents had failed to teach them. So as we go through this chapter, and even through the book, future chapters, you'll notice times when Moses says, repeatedly, specifically, exhorting this generation to teach the history of Israel and the covenant, and even the blessings that God had given them to their children and to their children's children. So this is a pattern that is being established to teach our children about God, his relationship with us, his holiness, his commandments, his love for us, his blessings to us. And of course, teach them these mirror truths. Loyalty and obedience to God lead to blessing, inheritance, and life. And disloyalty and disobedience to God lead to curses and exile and death. And of course, as we even go through other, the prophets in the Old Testament, we see that the Israelites were indeed exiled multiple times from the land because of disobedience. And so this is where this pattern is set down. What we're going to do as we did last week and sort of read through a short section and then make some comments about it and go through this verses 1 really through 43 of chapter 4, if you would follow as long as I read. And then we'll basically come back to these two truths, which are really the point of the chapter, that we need to learn this as well. So verses 1 through 8. Moses says, "Now, Israel, pay attention to the statutes and ordinances I am about to teach you, so that you might live and go on to enter and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Do not add a thing to what I command you, nor subtract from it, so that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I am delivering to you. You have witnessed what the Lord did at Baal Peor, how he eradicated from your midst anyone who followed Baal Peor. But you who remained faithful to the Lord your God are still alive to this very day, every one of you. Look, I have taught you statutes and ordinances, just as the Lord my God told me to do so that you might carry them out in the land you are about to enter and possess. So be sure to do them, because this will testify of your wise understanding to the people who will learn of all these statutes and say, 'Indeed, this is a great nation and a very wise people.'" Moses goes on, "In fact, what other great nation has a God so near to them like the Lord our God, whenever we call on him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this whole law that I am about to share with you today?" And so as we see in the beginning of the chapter there, Moses he's giving them a charge. He said he has just spent the last 3 chapters saying, remember, the history of how we got here. And then he's saying, now, Israel, pay attention. Pay attention, obey, listen. Remember that listen involves more than merely hearing, but it involves obeying. Your mother would tell you, or maybe you told your children, listen to me, obey me. It was implied. It wasn't just hear what I say and then go about your business ignoring me. No, that was going to get you a whap on the bottom in most cases in our generation, was it not? No. So Moses is saying, listen, pay attention to these statutes and ordinances I'm about to teach you. Now, they had obviously should have learned them in the past. Moses gave these same statutes and ordinances at Sinai that God had delivered to him. But it's almost as if it's brand new. I am about to teach you. And then he says something very interesting. Why is it important for them to learn these and to pay attention to obey them? He says, so that you might live and go on to enter and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. This is a covenant. This is a conditional. You need to obey God. You need to keep these commandments so that you may live and you may enter and take possession of the land. And take note that, they're aware at this point that God had, because he's told them in earlier chapters, that God had specifically forbidden their parents to go into the land because they did not follow the commandments. They did not obey God when God said, go into the land and take it. They said, no, we can't do that. We're afraid. And so they've seen what's going to happen if they don't. And their parents, what did they do? Are they still alive? No, they're not alive anymore. God said they're not going to go in. And so They wandered all that time, and their parents died off. He says, you have witnessed what the Lord did at Baal Peor. Now, Baal is a word that really means Lord. And so this was really worship of other gods. The other nations around them worshiped other gods. And so that was a reference to worshiping another god, Baal Peor, the Lord, the God at Peor, lowercase g. He says, you've witnessed that God eradicated from your midst anyone who followed the Lord, the God at Peor. But you who remained faithful are still alive. So this is the basis on which he's saying, you'll live. Remember, loyalty and obedience to God lead to blessing, inheritance, and life. And so this is really a restatement of that. And then he goes on and he talks about this. Indeed, this nation, the people will look at you and say, this nation is very wise, a very wise people. Well, later on we'll see that because this is talking about Israel being unique. But later on we'll see the reason Israel is unique is because their God is unique. No other nation has a God so close to them that answers them when they call on him, when they seek him. We'll get to that a little bit later. He says that here in verse 7, I should say. In fact, what other great nation, Moses says, has a God so near like the Lord our God whenever we call on him? And then he says, the laws of these other nations, they're not just. They're not righteous laws like our laws. And why is that? Because God is a righteous and just God, and he gave them the laws, the ordinances they're to follow. And then he goes on and he says in verses 9 through 4, we're going to read starting in verse 9 to 10. He says, again, however, pay careful attention, lest you forget the things you've seen and disregard them for the rest of your life. Instead, teach them to your children and grandchildren. You stood before the Lord your God at Horeb or at Sinai, and he said to me, assemble the people before me so that I can tell them my commandments. Then they will learn to revere me all the days they live in the land, and they will instruct their children. And so we see this, this need to teach our children, because they're not going to learn it automatically. They're not just going to pick it up from watching us go to church. They're not going to know the history. What has God done for us? We were unfaithful to him, and yet he loved us and he brought us back to him. Even our very salvation is something that they won't know about unless we tell them about it. And so, but he starts out there in verse 9 and he reiterates what he said in verse 1. He had said, pay attention. Now in verse 9 he says, again, pay very careful attention, lest you forget what he preached in chapters 1 through 3. Now, as we go into these next verses, it's interesting. There is this structure, and I'm not an expert in I won't say I'm an expert in really Bible study, but in Hebrew or in the Bible, they often use this structure called a chiastic structure. And it was this structure where they would say something and then say something and then say something, and then they'd get to the heart of it, and then they would repeat what they said and repeat what they said. So it basically reinforces what he's saying, and it also serves to really hone in on what is the point. What does the writer consider important here? And this really is found all through the scriptures. And it would probably be helpful for us to, focus in, to learn these things so that we can focus in on that a little bit more. Well, the first one here is in verses 11 to 14, and it is that at Horeb, or at Sinai, how did Yahweh speak? How did God speak to the people? He spoke to them from the fire. And so in verse 11, Moses says, "You approached and stood at the foot of the mountain, a mountain ablaze to the sky above it, and yet dark with a thick cloud. Then the Lord spoke to you from the middle of the fire. You heard speech, but you could not see anything. Only a voice was heard. And he revealed to you the covenant he has commanded you to keep, the 10 Commandments written on 2 stone tablets. Moreover, at the same time, the Lord commanded me to teach you statutes and ordinances for you to keep in the land that you are about to enter and possess." Now, a couple things to note here. This should look a little bit familiar to us, because this isn't the first time that Moses had heard God's voice out of a fire. Remember that when Moses, after he had left Egypt, ran away from Egypt because he had killed an Egyptian, and he ran out to the desert. He was afraid, and what happened? God came to him in a burning bush. And so God spoke to him out of fire. Moses did not see God, and yet a voice came out of the burning bush. And so here again we have Moses at Mount Sinai hearing God speak out of the fire. And the Israelites witnessed this, he says. Well, and one other thing I want to note, and he said it a couple of times now, he said something about, the reason why they were to observe these statutes and ordinances. And he says, for you to keep in the land which you're about to enter and possess. In other words, this is a set of statutes. You're going to go into this land, and this gives you the guidelines of how to live in this land I've promised you. He's tried to teach them from Mount Sinai through the wilderness and now at the precipice. And the purpose of this is for how to live in that land that he's given them. So we go on now to verses 15 through 19, and we see that it's something important. Moses emphasizes to them that they are not to have any graven image of God, or any graven image at all. He says in verse 15, "Be very careful then, because you saw no form at that time the Lord spoke to you at Horeb from the middle of the fire. I say this so you will not corrupt yourselves by making an image in the form of any kind of figure. This includes the likeness of a human male or female, any kind of land animal, any bird that flies in the sky, anything that crawls on the ground, or any fish in the deep waters of the earth. When you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, the whole heavenly creation, you must not be seduced to worship and serve them, for the Lord your God has assigned them to all the people of the world." So this is really a prohibition to idolatry of any kind, to putting anything before God. And not only putting anything before God, but if they so much as made a graven image, then it could, God knew that it could and would become the thing they worshiped instead of them worshiping God himself. And so he gave this prohibition against graven images. And we know that if we look at the peoples around Israel at the time, they made such graven images. They made statues. They made, even altars. They made all of these things. You remember so names just run right out of my head when I'm about to say them. You remember Elijah at the altar to Baal. They were worshiping Baal, and he he said, you pray to your God and see if fire will come down to burn up this sacrifice, and I'll pray to my God. And furthermore, he had drenched it with water just to demonstrate that it wasn't just a spark, and that it was God supernaturally, consuming this sacrifice. And so through fire, God consumed and proved his presence even then, when Elijah was challenging these false prophets, these that were worshiping other gods. Okay, so now we move on to verse 20, and we see that he says, Yahweh took you out of Egypt to become his inheritance. He says, you, however, the Lord has selected and brought from Egypt, that iron smelting furnace, to be his special people as you are today. And I don't know if your translation says his inheritance, but in other places he talks about them being his inheritance. But the whole idea, his special people, his inheritance, his family, really. And then he goes on, and in verse 21, and we get to the center of this chiastic structure. And he says, but the Lord became angry with me because of you, and vowed that I would never cross the Jordan nor enter. And so Moses is saying to the people, look, I am a witness of God's, demands to be holy, because he's not allowing me to go into the land. Now, it's interesting. I always wonder, I don't know. I wonder, was this the way God saw it? He blames it on the people because of you. He did this earlier in chapters 1-3 as well. I don't know. You've always heard Moses didn't get to go into the land because he smote the rock. Well, that's not what Moses says here. He says, because, and I think it was probably related to the fact that when the spies came back and said, we can't enter the land, Moses didn't say, that's not the question. God said, enter the land, we're entering the land. No, he followed their advice. He allowed their unfaithfulness to overrule his own obedience to God. And so the Lord did not allow him to enter the land. And then he begins this to kind of repeat what he said. And so you'll see this structure on the screen. He says and it's, it's kind of intermixed here, but at the end of verse 21, he had said that I would never cross the Jordan nor enter the good land that he is about to give you. So I must die in this land. I will not cross the Jordan. But you are going over and will possess that land. And so, we see this where Yahweh first took them out of Egypt so that they would be his inheritance. And now Yahweh is giving them the land of Canaan as their inheritance. And then in verse 23, we see he says, be on guard so that you do not forget the covenant of the Lord your God that he has made with you, and that you do not make an image of any kind, just as he has forbidden you. So he repeats that prohibition to make an image. And then last in verse 24, we see he says, for the Lord your God is a consuming fire. He is a jealous God. So he brings them back to what he had originally started with. He's a consuming fire. I mean, at Horeb, at Sinai, they had observed, he was a fire, but he was talking with them. He was making a covenant with them. But now Moses kind of presents this in a little different light. He's a consuming fire. He's a jealous God. He wants you to serve him and him alone. He wants you to be faithful to him and him alone. And so this idea of these graven images really is I think, much more than merely graven images. I think that it really is to focus in on the idea of that you are not to put anything before God, that you are not to have any idols. And so idolatry will become a major theme both throughout Deuteronomy and through the Old Testament. And really, it should be a major theme for us today, because we are so tempted to put things before him and not even realize it. We've normalized idolatry largely in our society today. We'll pick that thread up later, but let's go on. As we look at verses 25 through 28, we see really consequences from covenant disobedience. So he says, after you have produced children and grandchildren and have been in the land a long time, if you become corrupt and make any image of any kind, or do other evil things before the Lord your God that enrage him, I invoke heaven and earth as witness against you today that you will surely and swiftly be removed from the very land you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. You will not last long there, because you will surely be annihilated. Then the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, the other nations, and there will be very few of you among the nations where the Lord will drive you. There you will worship gods made by human hands, wood and stone that can neither see, hear, nor smell. So he gives them this reminder, and really more than a reminder, it's almost a prediction. He says, you will not last long there. You will surely be annihilated. You will surely be removed from the very land. And indeed, as we go through the Old Testament, we see Israel not being faithful to keep God's commands, and the ultimate result was that they were exiled. Later on, they were able to go back to the land. But why were they able to go back to the land? They were able to go back to the land because they were restored. He says in verse 29, but if you seek the Lord your God from there, so even though you've been exiled, if you seek the Lord your God from there, you will find him. If indeed you seek him with all your heart and soul, in your distress, when all these things happened to you in the latter days, if you return to the Lord your God and obey him, for he is a merciful God. He will not let you down or destroy you, for he cannot forget the covenant with your ancestors that he confirmed by oath to them. So they could be restored to the land once again if they seek him. And then he goes on here in verses 32 to 40, and he talks not about the uniqueness of Israel, but about the uniqueness of their God, that their God is, the Lord alone is God. There is none beside him, he says in verse 40. So we begin in verse 32. He says, indeed, ask about the distant past, starting from the day God created humankind on the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other, whether there has ever been such a great thing as this, or even a rumor of it. Have a people ever heard the voice of God speaking from the middle of fire, as you yourselves have, and lived to tell about it? Or has God ever before tried to deliver a nation from the middle of another nation, accompanied by judgments, signs, wonders, war, strength, power, and other very terrifying things, like the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? You have been taught that the Lord alone is God. There is no other besides him. From heaven he spoke to you in order to teach you, and on earth he showed you his great fire, from which you also heard his words. Moreover, because he loved your ancestors, he chose their descendants who followed them, and personally brought you out of Egypt with his great power, to possess nations greater and stronger than you, and brought you here this day to give you their land as your property. Today realize and carefully consider that the Lord is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. And then in verse 40, really, he reiterates this whole idea. He says, keep his statutes and commandments that I am setting forth today, so that it may go well with you and your descendants, and that you may enjoy longevity in the land that the Lord your God is about to give you as a permanent possession. He reiterates that idea that loyalty and obedience to God result in blessings, inheritance, and life. And in fact, that verse really mirrors what he had said in verse 1. Now, Israel, pay attention to the statutes and ordinances that I am about to teach you, he said in verse 1, so that you might live and go on to enter and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Listen and obey, he says. Listen and obey. Well, then we come to these kind of interesting 3 verses that feel somewhat out of place. I'm not sure myself how to say exactly why they fit here well. I'll leave that as an exercise to the student. How's that? But I'll read them and we'll comment on them briefly. He says, then Moses selected 3 cities in the Transjordan. That means the side of the Jordan they were on right now, they had not yet crossed over, toward the east. Anyone who accidentally killed someone, or we call it manslaughter, without hating him at the time of the accident, could flee to one of those cities and be safe. These cities are Bezar in the desert plateau for the Reubenites, Ramoth in Gilead for the Gadites, and Golan in Bashan for the Manasseites. And these we call the cities of refuge, where if someone was killed but it was an accident, it was manslaughter essentially, then you could find refuge there and be safe from being, from revenge from, whoever, the family or, whoever you accidentally killed. And on the other side of the Jordan, there would later be 3 additional cities set aside for cities of refuge. So really, what is the point today of this passage? And we've already said it multiple times, but number 1, loyalty to God and obedience to his commands leads to blessing, inheritance, and life. Now, does this mean that we earn our salvation? No, it doesn't. In fact, if you look at it carefully, he had already said that the reason for giving the law was so to give them the law that they would live by in the land. After they crossed the Jordan, that was the purpose of it. Now, we've been given commands in Scripture. We've been given not suggestions, but commands. And Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. No, this is not in order to prove it's not in order to gain his love. It's because we've already accepted him as Savior. We're already believers. We obey his commands because he's already saved us. Not in order to be saved. But there is a truth that we will find blessing, inheritance, and life if we obey him. And we will, conversely, if we disobey, if we're disloyal to God, we will find cursing and exile and death. We will not find his blessing. Now, there's a common theology that is preached from many pulpits today, may be preached this very morning. And now it just boom. I guess my The age of my brain is catching up to the age of my eyes. We call it. We say that we obey God and He owes us. What's the name of the? I don't want to name any names. Say it again. No, I'm so sorry. This is so frustrating when I don't write down a specific word that I want to say. The theology of that God will bless me because I obey Him. I will get what I want because I obey Him. Prosperity theology. Thank you so much. I will prosper. Well, of course, there's a truth in that. The problem with that is that most of the people that preach and follow prosperity theology are looking for things for themselves. It's money, it's health, it's all of the wisdom, it's being exalted in some way, it's power, it's all of these things that they basically, these things we call idols. It's idolatry. The prosperity theology that is largely taught becomes idolatry. No, the blessings God promises us are the things that He loves us, His presence with us. See, Israel didn't understand that His presence with them as they wandered through the wilderness was a blessing. That's the kind of thing, that they should seek, is what God wants for them, not what they wanted for themselves. So this is not the prosperity theology that we hear preached so often. No, this is that God will give us true blessing. He will give us inheritance. He will give us life. These are the things that we gain because we follow Him. And I shouldn't say we gain because we follow Him. He's given those to us already, really. And then He says, now follow me, obey me. So later in Deuteronomy, Moses is going to come back after he goes through all of the law and the commandments. And in chapter 30, he's going to say something that really is pivotal. And you'll probably hear me say this week after week after week as we go through here. Hopefully not too many weeks, right? Choose life by loving the Lord your God and by listening to Him or obeying Him. Where specifically what he says in chapter 30, verses 19 and 20, he says, "Today I invoke heaven and earth as a witness against you that I have set life and death. I have given you life and death, blessing and curse before you. Therefore choose life so that you and your descendants may live. I also call on you to love the Lord your God, to obey Him and be loyal to Him, for He gives you life and enables you to live continually in the land that the Lord promised to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Choose life. He wants us, He demands a love for Him and a loyalty to Him. Really, those two go hand in hand. If we say we love Him, but we aren't, exercising that by, proving our loyalty by obeying Him, then we don't really love Him. So today, we are challenged to choose life by loving the Lord our God and by listening to Him. Let's close in a word of prayer. Our Lord Jesus, we